Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're popping the hood on an entire country's economy to unravel the true meaning behind what is probably the most famous and, let's be honest, most misunderstood economic acronym in the world, GDP. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this because once you actually see how this engine works, the way you understand global news and local markets is going to completely change.
I mean, think about it for a second. We hear politicians bragging about it, financial anchors panicking over it, and newspapers printing it in huge, bold headlines constantly. But what does this three-letter metric actually represent in your daily life? Is it just the money in your pocket? Is it the total number of factories in your state? Well, it's a bit more specific than that. And truly understanding it is absolutely crucial to understanding the health of the world around us.
Okay, here's our game plan for today. 1. What exactly is GDP? 2. The rules of the count. 3. Three ways to compute it. 4. Inflation, real versus nominal. 5. GDP and living standards. And finally, 6. What GDP leaves out. Let's get into it.
Section 1. What exactly is GDP? The core definition of an economy's output. So, gross domestic product, or GDP, is formally defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specific period. We actually owe a huge debt to economist Simon Kuznets, who helped create this incredibly broad measurement. Now, a really key detail here is that phrase specific period, because it only measures new production. If you buy a brand new car built this year, yep, it counts. But if you resell that exact same car 3 years from now, doesn't count. It's kind of like how a coffee shop tracks their daily sales. A nation uses GDP to act as a real-time barometer for its overall economic health.
Moving on to Section 2, the rules of the count, market values and final products.
Okay, imagine a country grows 12 billion bushels of corn and builds 8 million cars. How do we even add those up? You can't just say the economy produced 12 billion and 8 million things. That is literally the classic apples and oranges problem. So instead, we use their dollar market values to give us a nice, clean, combined number, say $300 billion for our GDP calculation. And remember, this whole shebang includes services too. In fact, services like healthcare and education make up about 2/3 of the U.S. economy today. Next up, we only count final goods and services. The absolutely crucial point here is avoiding the double counting trap. Let's say you have a cell phone that sells for $99. Inside that shiny new phone is a $15 computer chip. That chip is what we call an intermediate good. If we counted the chip's value when it was made, and then counted the full $199 phone later, we'd be counting that same $15 chip twice. No way around it. So, government statisticians take great care to only count the final product sold to the ultimate user.
And we definitely can't forget the D in GDP, domestic. This means the item must be produced within a nation's physical geographic borders, completely regardless of who actually owns the factory. For instance, if the American company Nike manufactures shoes over in Thailand, the value of those shoes counts toward Thailand's GDP, not the United States. Now, if we wanted to measure what a country's residents produced anywhere in the world, we'd use a totally different metric called gross national product, or GNP. But GDP, it focuses strictly on domestic soil.
Section 3. Three ways to compute it. The math behind the machine.
So the most common method here is the expenditure approach. The formula is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. It basically just adds up all the spending for final products. We've got C for consumption. That's you and me buying groceries or going out to get a haircut. Then I for investment, which is businesses buying tools or building factories to produce future output. Next is G for government spending, like building a new highway or paying teachers' salaries. And finally, we add exports and subtract imports.
Wait, hold on a second. Let's pause right here. If GDP is all about measuring our total economy, why in the world are we subtracting imports in our formula? Just take a moment and consider how a foreign-made product fits into a metric that is entirely focused on domestic production.
Well, it basically comes down to accounting. When data is collected for personal consumption, it just lumps together everything consumers bought, both domestic and imported stuff. Like, car dealers report all their total sales to the government, but they don't separate the foreign cars from the domestic ones in that initial report. Since GDP only measures domestic economic activity, we absolutely must subtract those foreign imports out at the very end. Otherwise, we'd accidentally measure another country's economic activity and claim it as our own.
Now, while the expenditure approach is definitely the most popular, there are two other ways to compute GDP, and conceptually, they all yield the exact same result. The income approach just adds up all the income earned by households and firms, so your wages, rent, interest, and profits. Alternatively, there's the production approach. This one calculates the value added at every single stage of making a product, like carefully tracking the value added from the farmer's raw wool to the factory's fabric all the way to the tailor's final suit. 3 different paths, but they all lead to one massive economic number.
Section 4. Inflation, real versus nominal. Removing the inflation air from the balloon.
All right, because GDP heavily relies on market values, we hit a massive speed bump when prices rise because of inflation. Imagine a country produces the exact same number of cars and corn as they did last year, but for whatever reason, the prices doubled. The nominal GDP, which uses current prices, would make it look like the economy doubled, but the actual output didn't change at all. Looking at nominal GDP without considering inflation is kind of like looking through a pair of binoculars and trying to guess the distance without knowing how strong the lenses are. You're going to be way off. That's exactly why economists rely on real GDP, which adjusts for inflation to show us the true production growth over time.
And this formula beautifully illustrates the math behind the fix. Statisticians use a very specific price level measure called the GDP deflator. By taking the raw nominal GDP, dividing it by the GDP deflator, and then multiplying by 100, they effectively let the inflation air right out of the balloon. This gives us real GDP, a true, unclouded picture of actual economic growth.
Section 5. GDP and living standards. What the numbers actually mean for us.
This data from the world's largest economies paints a pretty fascinating picture. Back in 2019, the United States sat right at the top. But I want you to notice the stark contrast between China and Japan here. China's total GDP was roughly $14.3 trillion. That's nearly 3 times as much as Japan's $5.08 trillion. So does that mean the average person living in China was 3 times better off? Well, not exactly. I mean, total GDP is super important, sure, but it's really not the best indicator of living standards for a typical person. You see, China has a massive population, roughly 10 times larger than Japan's. When we take that total GDP and divide it by the population, we get what's called per capita GDP, and suddenly the whole picture flips upside down. Japan's average living standard, their per capita GDP, was over $40,000, while China's was only about $10,000. So the huge takeaway here is that population size matters immensely when you're trying to gauge average prosperity. When we look at the trend of U.S. real per capita GDP over 50 years, we see this overall positive upward slope. That proves that long-term economic growth is absolutely happening. I mean, the typical person can afford roughly twice as much in education, food, and housing today as they could back in 1970. But do you notice those short-run dips along the way? Those represent business cycles, short-term economic downturns or recessions like the 2008 Great Recession, where total output actually falls before expanding again. Section 6. What GDP leaves out? Let's look at the blind spots of the metric. Economist Kate Raworth actually points out a major flaw here. GDP is quite limited because it only measures market activity. Think about it. If you pay someone to mow your lawn, bam, it boosts GDP. But if you mow it yourself, it counts for exactly 0. It completely ignores the massive societal value of unpaid work, like raising children or cooking at home. It also completely ignores leisure time. You could have 2 countries with the exact same GDP, but if one achieves it with 8-hour workdays and the other relies on grueling 12-hour workdays, their actual prosperity is vastly different. And crucially, it ignores environmental health. A country could heavily pollute its own air and water just to produce more goods, artificially raising its GDP while actually harming its citizens' health.
Our sources sum this up perfectly. Standard of living is a broader term than GDP. It includes all elements that affect people's well-being, whether they are bought and sold in the market or not. Look, GDP is an incredible, rough-and-ready measure of economic activity and market health, for sure. But it is just one dial on the dashboard. Activity does not perfectly equate to overall human prosperity.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to really chew on. If GDP only measures what we buy and sell, what is the true price of our well-being? The next time you see a news headline flashing about GDP going up or down, remember exactly what is and what isn't being counted. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.